Open theism is a view of God in which God is open to creatures. What creatures do affects God. And the word open is used in a second sense. The idea is that the future is open as well, in that there's more than one possible future. There are multiple possible futures. So God is open to creatures, but the future is open as well. And open theism arises out of a family of theology and philosophy called free will theism. The idea is that creatures, particularly humans, have libertarian free will, which in the vernacular simply means that a person could have done otherwise had they wanted to do something in a particular situation. So free will theism is found in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And there have been open theists in these traditions for a long time. But again, it's important to understand that open theism arises out of a tradition called free will theism. So in free will theism, it is opposed to what's called theological determinism, which is the view that God meticulously or tightly controls everything and every event that happens. Free will theism says, no, creatures have free will, and so God does not control. This is a watershed divide between theological determinism and free will theism. And open theism emphasizes this theological divide. So some of the questions you can ask here are, does God ever respond to creatures? Does God ever have changing mental states in response to what creatures do? Does God ever modify divine plans or plan in some way to adapt to what creatures do? And theological determinism says no, God is totally determined to all events. Free will theism says no, God does adjust the divine plans and takes into account what creatures do in God deciding what to do next. So does God ever respond? Are any of God's, another way to ask the question is, are any of God's decisions contingent or dependent upon what creatures do? And free will theism says yes, and theological determinism says no to that. So these are the watershed divide questions that one can ask. So now, here are some features that free will theists hold and that open theists emphasize, but still commonality of free will theism. So let me give you several points here. So first of all, free will theists emphasize that God creates beings to be in a loving and ongoing dynamic relationship with God. And God enters into what we call dynamic, it's ongoing activity, of give and take relationships with creatures. So there's an ongoing relationship with God. That's God gives, but God also receives. And so this means that God is flexible in the way that God interacts with creatures. It's not a foregone conclusion of exactly what God will do in a particular situation. So God has flexible strategies for accomplishing divine purposes instead of a blueprint. So there is no blueprint where everything is happening exactly the way God wants it. That's theological determinism. So in free will theism, there is an open-endedness to what's going on between God and creatures. And open theists emphasize this point. So one could say that it's like playing jazz. So God is the perhaps lead person in the band, but in jazz, everyone takes riffs and everyone has to contribute. And God works these contributions into a harmonious pattern, if the band members are willing. This also means, though, that God doesn't tightly control what the band members play because of free will. So this means that some of what God wants to happen may not happen. God may want a particular musical instrument to be played in a certain way, and it doesn't happen. We may go against God's moral will and do things that God would rather us not do and harm others, other creatures, other people. So in free will theism, God takes risks. God does not get everything that God wants because God granted creatures free will. And this gets into issues such as the problem of evil and the like. So a final point about this God delegating is that God delegates responsibilities. God takes risks that we will not do things exactly the way that God would like for us to do them. So by delegating responsibility, things may not go exactly the way God wants them to, but God places a lot of responsibility upon the shoulders of creatures to care for one another, to care for the world that God has established for them. And this means that humans do bear a great deal of responsibility for what happens. Now, all this means then that God is not tightly in control of all things that happen. It also means that God is not totally immutable, that is, unable to change in any way. God must be able to change in some ways. Now, free will theists and open theists maintain that the divine nature, God's love, God's concern for people, God's wisdom, this doesn't change. But God can change in the way God relates and the specific actions that God takes in relation to individuals and to a nation such as Israel in the Bible. So it means that God is not strongly immutable. It also means that God is not strongly what we call impassible, which means an impassible deity is one that cannot be affected by creatures. So in theological determinism, God is not affected by creatures. God never responds. God never takes risks because God tightly controls everything. So God is totally impassible and God is totally immutable. And free will theists reject those ideas. And open theism emphasizes that those must be rejected. Okay, so now let's talk about the ways in which open theism has some distinctives from free will theism. We've put it in the free will family, but now let's see some distinctives. So the first is that open theists claim that if God has changing mental and emotional states, then God is temporal. God has sequence of events, a before and an after. So God interacts with Abraham, for instance, and Abraham then does something, and God then responds to what Abraham does. So there's a before and after. So this means that God is everlasting through time rather than timelessly eternal, or an eternal now, that God only has a present, a now, and never a before and an after, a past and a future. So open theists say that God is temporal. So some people then are scandalized by this because they say, oh, so God is in time. Okay, so what this is doing is the metaphor in time is saying that there's a container, all right? So here's the container, and here's God, and you put God inside the container. And open theists reject this idea. It is reifying time as a container of all events. And open theists maintain that as we'll see in a moment, the future does not have an ontological reality. That is, it's not like the past, which was real, and the present, which is real. It's an actual set of events that are occurring. So the future does not exist. So time is not a container of all events. Those who say time is a container of all events are affirming a view. It goes by various names, called the B theory of time, or four-dimensionalism, or eternal now, in which all events exist. The future events exist. Present events exist. Past events exist. Open theists are saying that no. Time is the experience of events, and future events have not happened yet. And so we anticipate them as possible events. So we're not saying that God is in time. We're saying that God has mental states of before and after. And just like you and I have these mental states, so God has a past and a present and a future as well. The second thing that open theists modify regarding free will theism is the idea of dynamic omniscience. So open theists maintain that God is omniscient. God is fully knowledgeable of all facts at any time. So God knows all the past exhaustively, and God knows all present events exhaustively, totally. God does not know what we call future events as actual. And the reason why, as I just said, they are not actual. There is no ontological reality called the future. Future events are possibilities, things that may happen, things that may not happen. And God knows them as possible events, not as actual events. So we are saying that God knows all reality. So God knows the past as a reality that has happened. God knows the present as a reality that is happening. And God knows the future possible events. And God can even know which ones are likely to happen and which ones are unlikely to happen. But they are possible events. They are what may or may not happen. They are not things that actually will happen. And God does not know them as actual events that will happen. God knows them as possible events. Now, a mistake here is that some people say, some critics have said, so open theists maintain that God does not know the future. That's wrong. There is no future to know outside of possibilities. And God knows all the possibilities. So God knows the future as it is, which is possible. What the critics say is that the future is an actual set of events. That is, there are truths about all those events, and there are actual events, and they're in the future. And that's exactly the ontology that open theists are rejecting. So we are not saying that God is ignorant of any reality. That's a mistake. God is fully cognizant of all reality. The past as has happened, the present as is happening, and the future as possibilities that can happen. Okay, so how does this view then work out in terms of providence? So open theists hold that God does not look into the future and see actual events, rather, because they're not there. God anticipates what humans do and takes into account what they actually do. So God would know, for instance, the different jobs that a certain person is looking into. Say Mary is looking into a couple of different jobs. And God knows what the supervisors are like and what the colleagues are like and what the finances of the company are like. And so God may, in terms of prayer and dialogue with the person, may say that, may have one company is better to pursue than another. But God does not know with certainty what will happen and what the supervisor will do in the future, but God can have good ideas of what these possibilities are. So some people think that God would know for sure what would happen, and so God would advise you otherwise. I'll talk about that in a minute, why that's not possible. So God gives guidance and advice based on the circumstances that have happened, the full knowledge of all that is happening now, and what's likely or unlikely to happen in the future. So God does not determine these events, and God is not in control of them because God has granted free will to creatures. And so providence is God working with creatures and adapting and responding in give and take ways as we go through history, rather than a single monotone plan that's carried out forever. Now, let me address then some arguments for support for open theism. These are not proofs. These are simply reasons that can support open theism. So first, some theological and philosophical reasons for open theism. First one is that open theists, along with free will theists, say that this give and take relationship and the dynamic relationship with God is necessary to uphold free will theism. And open theism modifies free will theism in terms of divine temporality and dynamic omniscience, because it thinks that free will theism has mistakenly adopted the divine timelessness idea and what's called simple foreknowledge, which I'll get to in a moment. And so open theists want to say that in order to affirm this dynamic relationship, we really have to affirm both divine temporality and dynamic omniscience. Now, let's think about a little more about God's relationship to time and the future. A timeless deity really excludes what I'm going to say a little later on about the biblical portrayal of God, which is a give and take relationship. And we think that it really undermines free will. So in order to affirm the basis of free will theism, we should affirm open theism. And we also need to affirm a particular theory of time and reject another theory. So we open theists affirm what's called the A theory or dynamic theory of time, which is that the present occupies an ontological state that's different from the past. The past has happened, it is not happening now. And the future does not exist. The future is not an ontological reality, it's only possible events. The idea that God is timelessly eternal presupposes that the B theory or the stasis theory of time is correct. That's the view that all events, or like if you take a yardstick or a ruler, all events are on the ruler. They're future events to us, but they exist. So they are timelessly on this ruler, and God experiences all of them at once. So there are several problems with this timeless view of God and free will theism. One of the problems is that it reifies all events, and it's called the block theory of time. All events are on the block, or the yardstick of time. And this entails determinism, that it can't be changed. All the future events are there, and they cannot be undone. So whoever is going to be president of the United States 20 years from now, it's already on there. It can't be changed. So these events are determined. That you were watching this video now was determined. It wasn't in your power to change it because it was always on the block of events in time. So open theists say we must reject the block theory, the B theory of time, and really go with the dynamic theory of time, in which God engages creatures in an ongoing fashion. Another problem with eternal now is that God knows, according to a timeless eternal now, God knows all the events on the yardstick of time. But which ones are happening now? For instance, does God know that right now you're watching this video? If God is timelessly eternal? And the answer is no. God does not know now. God knows that you watch this video, and God knows what you do, what happens prior to the video, you're watching the video, and what happens after you watch the video. But God is not aware that you are watching it now. So there is a set of events, or an experience, we could say, a mental state called now, and God does not know that. So if you say that God is timeless and eternal now, then there are certain states of affairs that God does not know. God does not know what is happening now, at the present time. So we think that's a failing of the timeless view. So open theists believe that the dynamic theory of time and the idea that God is temporal is fully compatible with God experiencing dynamic interchange relationships with creatures. And I'm going to go into in a few minutes the biblical portrayal of God. Now, there are also other theological, philosophical reasons for open theism. One of them is the rejection of other views of divine omniscience. So let me take a couple of those views and talk about them. So the main one that people have is a view called simple foreknowledge or timeless knowledge. In this view, God somehow just knows everything that's ever going to happen. So prior to God's creating, God knew all the events in human history at once. And in this view, has a number of problems. So 3 problems in particular. First, we think that it is incompatible with the biblical portrayal of God. Secondly, it's incompatible with human libertarian freedom. So if there are facts about the future, truths about the future, about your future, and they've always been true, and God knows them, then it's not in your power to change them. So if God always has known that Abraham Lincoln would be assassinated, okay, so prior to creation, God knew that that was going to happen, and Lincoln would not serve out the second term of his presidency in the United States. If God always knew that was going to happen, if God always knew that the Holocaust was going to happen, okay, then there's nothing God can do to step in to try and influence any of those events. They're just facts. And that means that humans don't have libertarian freedom. Now, this is an old debate. It's gone on for well over 2,300 years. And many people just don't buy it. Okay? They say, no, God knows it, but that doesn't mean that we lack free will. Open theists are unpersuaded by those arguments and believe that no, the options are really theological determinism or free will. Now, that's 2 arguments. A third reason against simple foreknowledge is one that many people have not thought of and really taken into account. And that is that if God foreknows all the future events, it doesn't do God any good to have that knowledge. It's useless. That is, foreknowledge is useless for providence. Let me explain. If God eternally knows that you're going to watch this video at this time, then God, and it's a fact, okay, so God knows all facts, all truths about the future, then it's not in God's power to do anything about it. So I mentioned Abraham Lincoln. God can't do anything about it. God couldn't take steps to eliminate that. God cannot stop what God knows is going to happen. You can't say, God knows you're going to watch this video at this time, and then say, oh, for some reason God would rather you not watch the video at this time. And so God took steps to prevent you from doing it. No, if God eternally knows it, then this is what has to happen. And so God can know that an event is going to happen, but then God is powerless to do anything about that event. So one of the reasons why simple foreknowledge was created was the idea that if God foreknew that something bad was going to happen, or God knew you were going to pray about something, then God takes that into account and does things to either prevent that event or bring about something you prayed for. But it won't work, because if what God knows are the facts, so God knows that you pray, but God knows that this event happens and your prayer, what you prayed for doesn't come about, there's nothing God can do about that. So if God knows that something's going to happen, God cannot prevent that event from happening or do anything that would make it unhappen, because then God's knowledge would have been wrong. And by omniscience, God's knowledge is always right. So simple foreknowledge has real problems that the proponents of free will theism need to realize and act on, which is why we advocate dynamic omniscience. Now, there are other views that some free will theists affirm. One is called middle knowledge or Molinism, in which God knows not only what's possible futures, but God knows what would happen if something else was different in the situation. And open theists reject middle knowledge, Molinism as well. There are different reasons why, and you can look those up on the internet and find out why. I won't really go into them. But open theists generally think that middle knowledge does not really uphold free will. We think that there's facts of the matter that the proponent of middle knowledge has about the future that undermine free will. And if you undermine free will, then you're not part of the free will theist family. All right, the second main set of reasons to support open theism are biblical texts. So we went into theological, philosophical reasons, and then there are some biblical reasons to support open theism. Of course, the dynamic relationship with God in the biblical narratives is a big part of that. So some of the biblical texts that open theists use to support this position, for instance, the Bible says that God grieves over human sin. God grieves over what individuals do and what Israel does, and God wishes that it was a different way. So grieving, well, how can you grieve if you planned everything? Okay, if everything's happening according to the way you planned it, or everything's happening exactly the way that you foreknew it would, grieving doesn't make sense. Also, God puts people and nations to the test to, quote, see what they will do or find out what they will do. Well, divine testing doesn't make sense if God has predetermined everything, or if God eternally knows all the events. Why does God put Abraham to the test in chapter 22 of Genesis, for instance? If God knows exactly what Abraham's going to do, that doesn't make sense. So, putting people to the test, responding to prayers. God also is over 36 times said to change the divine mind. Now, there are 3 texts in the Hebrew Bible where God says, I refuse to change my mind. So 3 instances God says, I won't change my mind. But there are 36 references to God changing the divine mind. And even part of Israel's, what we call proto-credo formula in Joel, for instance, says that Yahweh is a God who is benevolent, gracious, compassionate, long-suffering, patient, etc., and changes the divine mind. So God can change the divine mind. Sometimes this happens because God says, I promised this to Eli's sons, for instance, 1 Samuel chapter 2. I promised this. But look at them. They're so wicked, I'm changing my mind. I'm not going to follow through on the promise that Eli's sons would be priests forever in Israel, or that Saul would be king forever. 1 Samuel 13, for instance, says Saul would have been king forever in Israel, but God changed the divine mind about that. So these changes of divine mind, and there are passages in the Hebrew Bible where God does predict some events that come to pass, but there are other events that God predicts that don't happen as God said they would. One of the biggest examples of that is Ezekiel chapter 26, where God says King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon will totally capture the city of Tyre. And then we know in chapter 28 of Ezekiel, the prophet says, well, Nebuchadnezzar did not capture the city of Tyre. So there are biblical predictions that come about, and some biblical predictions that do not come about. And so we think that dynamic omniscience is a way to explain these. How so? Well, it's a way of explaining either that these were events that God unilaterally brought about, or God determined to bring about, dependent upon divine power, or these events were conditional. That is, God is saying this will happen if Nebuchadnezzar does this, or if this happens. So there are conditional predictions of events. So we believe that those are ways of explaining the full range of biblical texts that we find in the Bible. Now, there are some questions about the view of open theism that I'd like to address that probably some of you have right now. One of them is, especially in looking at these biblical depictions of God, some people say, well, isn't that grossly anthropomorphic? I mean, isn't that making God into, a human being? And indeed, the biblical depiction of God, for some people, is overly anthropomorphic. But let me respond to that criticism a bit. First of all, in one of my books, Theology in the Flesh, I explain that all of our understanding of God is human understanding. We don't have any way of understanding atoms, dogs, divine beings, other than humans, the way humans' cognition works. And so all of our thinking is what I call anthropogenic. That is, it originates from the human cognitive toolkit that we have. So the only way of understanding God is the ways we think about things. So thinking of God as having a mind, thinking of God as having will, making decisions, etc., God as having love towards us, caring, those are all anthropomorphic ways of thinking of God. So the real issue for me is not whether we're going to think of God using human categories and human terms, it's which ones we're going to use. So even if you say God, for instance, is timeless, God is not in time, God is outside of time. Well, outside, of course, is a human way of thinking. Inside, outside, it's a human way of thinking. We're applying it to God. So you're saying these ideas of God are better to apply than those ideas. And that, we can have that debate about which ideas are appropriate to apply to God. But the idea that we're somehow using human terms to talk about God is illegitimate, well, then you're just going to have to be quiet. Okay. Another question that some people ask is, well, is this just process theology? Is it panentheistic? So panentheism has an en in the middle, so all is in God. Is this saying this? Well, it depends on your definition of panentheism. Some people define it as God cannot exist without a world. That is, some kind of world has to exist with God. Open theists typically reject this and affirm what's called creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. So God creates the universe, not from pre-existing material, God just creates it. So the idea that God can exist without a universe is affirmed by open theism. However, open theists so emphasize that God is involved with creatures in a very intimate and ongoing way that one can say that all is in God in that sense. But it depends on your definition of panentheism. So some open theists will use that term and others don't want to use the term. But it really depends on how you define it. And in process theology, well, open theism affirms what's called divine omnipotence, which we define as God can bring about any logically compatible state of affairs that's also compatible with the divine nature. So a logically consistent state of affairs. So can God make a colorless red automobile? And the answer is no, God cannot do that. Why? Because that's not a thing. That's not a logically possible state of affairs. Being colorless and the color red, you can't be both. So God can't do those things. And saving people and damning them simultaneously is logically incompatible. It's also not compatible with the divine nature. It's not something God would do. So we believe that God is omnipotent, and process theists reject that idea. And another difference between process theology and open theism is that open theism is not dependent upon any particular metaphysical system. It doesn't have a metaphysical system. It has metaphysical commitments, such as there's a God and there's a world, and the two are not the same. It has metaphysical commitments to libertarian freedom, for instance, and nature of time, the A theory of time. But it doesn't have a system, a philosophical system of thought. In conclusion, open theism is a highly relational view of God. It's not the only relational view of God, but it's a highly relational view of God, where God creates beings to be in a loving relationship with God, and there's a give and take relationship between those beings. But God does not control. God gives free will. God grants a lot of freedom, and God delegates tremendous responsibility, particularly to humans, to carry out the purposes of God in the world, to fulfill God's loving desire for all people to flourish and for all creatures to flourish and to benefit from God's good gifts of creation. A brief comment about the history of openness. As I said, it has existed for well over 1,000 years in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam. but it hasn't been all that popular. It's existed, but it hasn't grown to popularity until really in 1994, a group of authors, including myself, published a book called The Openness of God. And that put the model really on the map in biblical studies, theology, and philosophy of religion. And in philosophy of religion today, on the contemporary scene, open theism is a dominant model. It's theological determinism, Molinism, middle knowledge, and open theism are the main players by proponents of philosophers of religion who write on these topics. And biblical scholars largely affirm open theism as well. So it's become very popular. It's been around a long time in Judaism, but it's become more popular in Christianity. And I've been involved with many dialogues. I'm quite pleased that Muslim scholars are seeing open theism as a way to help bring some needed reform to theological deterministic theism, which is dominant in several forms of Islam. If you would like to know more about this, I encourage you to read some of the books. One I've authored is called The God Who Risks. A book by Clark Pinnock is called The Most Moved Mover. And one by Gregory Boyd is called The God of the Possible. And these are very helpful books. There are many others as well. And I encourage you to look at my website, which is drjohnsanders.com, drjohnsanders.com. And you'll find a section there on open theism, and it has lots of great amount of further information about open theism. Thank you.